Hi everyone, this is Manuela Lazic coming to you with a new episode of You Gotta Act, a podcast/show about actors and acting. And today my special guest is none other than writer, director, independent filmmaker Alex Rossberry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. You are in New York, right?
Yes, I'm in Brooklyn, where I've been this whole year.
Lovely.
And this is perhaps my first, video call-in show.
Oh yeah. Well, there you go. Somebody had to invent it. So
yeah, I don't know the rules for being on the whole time. It's easy on a podcast. You can kind of zone out, but this is very different. So
no, it's gonna be the same. You can chill. It's no pressure. You know, I'm the host. I'm the one who's meant to be kind of on all the time. You can be your own self. Don't worry about it. So Alex, you chose to talk about the great Geena Davis for this episode. But before we get into that, can you, as usual, I always ask that to guests. Can you tell us a bit about your journey to cinema and throughout filmmaking?
Well, I mean, I feel like just growing up, I watched so much TV. You know, this was the late 80s and the early 90s, and cable TV and VHS and pay-per-view. And I feel like just from a very young age, I was of a generation where entertainment, TV and movies were just so available. Video rentals, getting from the library or taping off of cable even. So I feel like the journey then was so geared towards having a finite number of options, a finite number of, once you tape something off of TV or bought a tape of it, it was something that, in my experience, you would watch over and over and over.
Right.
It was a very uncurious time, I think, to be loving watching things, because the idea just didn't really exist of, I like this, so I want to see everything else like it. It was more, I like this, I want to have a copy of it so I can just watch it over and over again, which was, it's very, I assume children today still sort of think like that because they don't know how to curate what they're watching. And I feel like from when I was growing up, that feeling just never went away, which meant that the things I was familiar with or watching were things that I would watch a lot. And that was just really comforting. So watching things became, you just identified people with the things you watch. So like, 80s, 90s, a great time for movie stars and character actors. You would just see people all the time. And for me growing up, you wouldn't even necessarily know their name, or I still don't. But if there was someone in a movie that you'd seen 20 times, you would, every time you saw them in something, go, oh, that's the person from that movie.
Right.
And that's still kind of how my brain works. And that just kind of continued. And it was only as I got older and lived in New York and had repertory movie theaters that I really became quite, voracious about seeing as much as possible. It was the first time that I wasn't just wanting to just sort of own, in a literal sense, but also in my brain, just a few important films.
So then how did you become a filmmaker though? How did you get to that point?
I went to NYU for film school. In my high school, in the basement, there was a cable access broadcast channel that the high school ran that was student run, that when I was in middle school, I aspired to participate in high school. I was in high school, I got there right away. And then people were seniors when I was freshmen began to graduate and go to film school, which I never really, when you're 10, 11, 12, you don't know that college really exists other than what you see on TV. So then learning that was a thing that people went to became sort of my dream. So then eventually realized I can go to college and continue to focus on the thing that seems to matter the most to me, making movies, hanging out in dark spaces with like-minded friends. And so then I ended up at NYU And it was just a very straight line. I mean, it just was, you're always making little projects. And then I was at the movies, 6-7 times a week all of a sudden, and something made sense. And I, finished NYU in 2006. And then by 2008, so only 2 years later, had just grown sort of impatient to wait for how we were taught your first movie gets made. And because this was a time where young people, first movies were suddenly cheaper than they'd ever been, by 2008, I went and made my first movie, and then just sort of continued making a movie basically every 18 months. From then on, just one after the other, because everything seemed so logical and possible.
Right. That's an interesting way to put to talk about the film industry. Like, usually people don't say it's logical, but I guess you figured out your formula.
But the industry certainly never was and isn't and wasn't then. But it just was a paradigm shift that happened sort of in front of my eyes, where people I knew were involved with in either shooting or being in or making movies that people made in under 10 days for under $10,000, under $5,000. And suddenly it just, what I always sort of said was, my senior thesis film at NYU, they're supposed to be under 30 minutes long. Mine was about 22 minutes. And I was one of the cheapest in my class. Only 10 people make them. And I think it cost like $20,000. And that was like the low end of what people were spending to make a film that is supposed to launch your career. And it never does. No one's, and once a generation, an NYU senior thesis film launches an industry career. And I thought this was how it worked. And I spent a year and a half kind of going in circles, just thinking, like, I made the short. Why aren't people wanting to pay me millions of dollars to make the feature of the short, which is how it was supposed to work?
Yeah.
They said. And then suddenly I was seeing, a friend of mine saying, oh, let's go to the screening. Someone I know is in this movie. And I go watch it. And it's, it's all takes place in available locations. And you hear at the Q&A, oh, it took 6 days to shoot and it cost $5,000. And I said, I need to make a feature 70 to 80 minutes. And it needs to be done short in fewer days and for less money than my 22-minute NYU thesis. So that was the goal right away. And we did. I mean, my thesis, I think, was a 9-day shoot for a 22-minute movie. And then my first film, which is called Impolex, was a 7-day shoot for a 73-minute movie. And it cost, half as much as my short. And it just, from there, it was like, this makes sense. And but also, like, to, focus on what you are talking about, like, from then on, and even up through later movies with known actors, the only thing I ever said was, like, the only thing you need is just the right performers and faces. The only reason any of these completely logistically non-exciting movies that have no infrastructure, no locations, no gear, no lighting, no anything, the only reason any of these are even remotely watchable is because some of them have incredibly compelling performers in them. Non-actors or trained actors who this is their first movie. It just, and I said it all along, like, and then even a few years later, making a movie I made called Queen of Earth, which was going back to this model, which we shot. And that movie was like a 12-day shoot in a single location. And I just said, like, you don't need anything other than good actors and a camera to make this movie. Like, yes, I understand we're telling people in the industry how much we made it for, or we're going to make it for. And they said, that doesn't seem possible. And I said, all we need is, we just need the actresses and we just need a camera, and we can afford both of those things. And then that's all we need. And from the very beginning, I feel like these sorts of films that me and my friends were making, just by necessity, the only thing you can do without spending money on locations, you can do without gear. We shot a movie all outside because we couldn't afford lights. You can do without, a tripod, which we couldn't afford, but you can't do without faces that are interesting to watch for 75 minutes. And that's the only thing I feel like anyone ever needed to make a movie that was even remotely worth watching. And from that point on, that was always really the engine that made me feel like I know what the next movie is.
It's interesting that you, from the get-go, you were like, it's about actors, it's about talented people in front of the camera. And I think it makes sense that you picked Geena Davis then for this, because the thing about her is that, to me, is that there's so much going on her face when she acts. She's a very expressive performer. And any film, if she's in it, she makes it come alive. And I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying of like, if you have someone who's interesting, who does something with their presence, then something happens. Where did you first encounter Geena Davis? Like, what was your first film that you noticed her and you were like, wow?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, to me, she was just like a ubiquitous movie star when I was growing up, even though at a young age, I could never remember who was who, her or Sigourney Weaver. To me, at the age of like 7, 8, 9, they were like, I would always see one and think it was the other.
I think it's the hair.
Just the hair, and they both seem like they're roughly the same height. They both seem like they're 6 feet ish, and like very girls. Yeah, very like broad shouldered. And for some reason, I just always assumed one was the other, in like a sort of like Mandela effect, like deep fake way. Like I could so easily picture Sigourney Weaver in Thelma and Louise or Geena Davis in Aliens. I could just for some reason, it just never made sense to me. So it wasn't until, at some point later that I just eventually realized like, oh, I can keep this straight. But, I wanted to talk about just somebody who to me is sort of the moment that I'm talking about, where, the late 80s and the 90s, my earliest memories of watching things, and a time where, an actor or an actress would be just totally famous, even if they've only been in 10 or 12 movies. It's not that they have been famous forever. They can newly be famous, but they are sort of in and of themselves the reason you would see the movies that they're in, and are, on talk shows and just doing real celebrity stuff. But at this time, to me, I feel like you could be somebody like Geena Davis, acclaimed Oscar early in her career, and still just be thought of as a celebrity and a movie star, rather than being thought of as like a serious actor first and foremost, and like a reluctant celebrity. Because at the time, I feel like people must have just been told as young talent, like, you have to be both. So it just seems like I was just interested in talking, because it just seems like there's not a lot of people like that are, post 70s. Like once you get out of the talent that became famous in the 70s, there's just not as many undeniable 80s movie stars. I think, and there's certainly not a lot of 80s female movie stars. There's a few, and to me, they're all incredibly important women, like I'm saying, like Sigourney Weaver, or, like Michelle Pfeiffer. Like there's just not a lot of like the big 80s movie star women. And those women are still really important to me, and still really exciting to see the work, because it was a really weirdly fertile time for incredibly, a diverse range of scripts that women at this time would have been doing. And they're all really young when they're doing them. So it's sort of like before the, aging out problem that, I feel like up until this point, no one had really thought about, because the only old actresses at this time were like actresses from the 40s.
Yeah, that's true.
There just weren't, there had not been that many decades of celebrities and movie stars aging by the 80s. It had only been a few. So it just seemed like an interesting time for young talent. And to me, yeah, she's just one of the men or women that totally represents that era. And like a lot of them, like really their work only exists in that era. They all had like shorter careers than I think they should have, or you would have thought.
No, I totally see what you mean. Like, I think looking at all her films, like the most celebrated ones from the 80s and 90s, they are really roles that give her a lot to do. Like they're very good female roles. And it's not a question of, is it like a strong female character? It's more like an interesting person, like an interesting character. And for some reason, she just got them all, these ones, and she was very good at them.
Yeah, and like what I was noticing when I was, looking at her filmography and suggesting like a couple of things to really focus on is like, in my mind, she was first and foremost thought of as like a comedian, like a gangly, like big smile, like funny performer. But then looking at the actual chronology, her career is much stranger than I had originally thought. And a lot of what triggered this for me was a couple of years ago at the Alamo Draft House here in Brooklyn, there was a Jeff Goldblum marathon.
Ooh,
and
nice.
In the marathon, first movie was Earth Girls Are Easy. And then the second movie was The Fly, both of which I, knew well and really liked. And during both of those movies, especially during The Fly, I was thinking like, wow, it's crazy that she went from Earth Girls Are Easy to this. And then after the movies was like, wait, The Fly is like such a subdued, dramatic performance that I think is probably why I always confused her and Sigourney Weaver, because her performance in that movie is very Alien Ripley-like. Yeah. But I just couldn't believe that after The Fly, this brooding, mature, sophisticated, serious drama about a relationship and technology, then she goes and makes the like 80s music video bikini aesthetic of Earth Girls Are Easy. And like, that blew my mind. And that to me was like one of the most interesting, eye-opening experiences in appreciating someone I already appreciated. Because I feel like at any other point in history, and with almost any other actor, a movie like Earth Girls Are Easy is sort of like the embarrassing weirdo early comedy. And then something like The Fly is the attempt at moving in a more serious direction. Yeah. But the fact that those movies are not in that order, there's something very telling about the fact that you would do a movie like The Fly and then not say, this is the only kind of performer that I am, and that you would then make essentially a cartoon and be so loose and like bulgy-eyed and funny in it, and like naive and strange. And then like, to me, like this is, still within like the first 5 years of her career. And watching those movies back to back, I was like, it must have been so confusing at the time to try to get a read on who she was as an actress, if these are the order that these movies came in. And that to me is like sort of, and neither movie really rests on her. I mean, I guess she's the lead in Earth Girls Are Easy, but that's just a high concept movie that obviously you feel like any number of people could have been in, but her sort of like goofy, wholesome, aw shucks performance in it is so grounded and so normal in a movie that is insane. I mean, just like a total relic. And like I said, just basically a cartoon. So yeah, like really the gap between those two movies and the order they came in is one of the most fascinating things I think about her career, or any kind of career.
I totally see what you mean. I think the first time I saw her was probably, well, it might have been Stuart Little because it was on TV, but I don't think I really registered her there. But then in high school, I had this amazing teacher who's kind of the reason why I got into film so much, Monsieur Gardesquin, if you're watching. He was like both my English teacher and my cinema studies, like cinema option teacher, and he made us watch Beetlejuice. And to me, she's that character from Beetlejuice because she is so, like you were saying, like she's wide-eyed, she's really funny, weird looking, but I think that's more like the 80s look, and tall, and just completely grounded. Like it's a typical Tim Burton sense of humor where like, something insane happens and the characters are just like, well, what do we do now? She really has this sort of comedic capacity that isn't straight comedy. It's more like amusing, but she's extremely funny when she does that. And in Of Girls Are Easy, it's kind of the same thing where she finds these aliens, hairy aliens in her pool, and she's like, well, I guess I have to drain the pool now. I don't know why she would go in that direction. I guess maybe just simply because she loved the projects and she found that, comedy has a lot to give. And if you can be a funny female character, I think that's really cool. Like, I would love to play a funny female character. That's just so much more interesting than, even a serious one sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, but this is, what I just, like about watching her, other than the fact that, no one has ever looked like her. And in those early movies, like, it's just, she is one of the most extremely distinct physical presences, of that or any other era. Just her body and her face and her teeth and her eyes and her hair, like, just nobody looked like her prior to that or since then, really. And she's just so interesting to just behold.
Yeah.
But even like in the movies after what we're talking about, like obviously most famously like Thelma and Louise or A League of Their Own, like those are, dramas, I guess, but like with a complete sense of levity.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like as a dramatic actress, outside of The Fly, which is a horror movie, it's just never totally a heavy performance. There is always this sort of sense of, I don't know, it just seems like easygoing, totally casual, in the sense that like you can't imagine people saying like, oh, like there's like she's fitting into this type that we're really casting a lot of right now. And yet all these movies, like these are roles, as with any great movie star performance, like you can't really picture anybody else in them unless you're me as a child and you're confusing actresses. But like even like a Sigourney Weaver, to use the example that I was confused by, like her in Thelma and Louise is like a much more serious performance because she's as great of a movie star, but like much less funny and just kind of like goofy and sweet.
Yeah.
She's just slightly more dramatic. And that to me is just sort of like the key to what I found so watchable about her and everything. Like, and that, I mean, that's just like the movie star answer, is like, she's just watchable in everything. Like recently I watched this movie on the Criterion Channel called Hero, which is this like not great, but totally enjoyable Dustin Hoffman sort of like wannabe Preston Sturges type satire. And she's the female lead in it and has basically nothing to do. And it's, a fine movie and like a totally interesting, I think it's directed by Stephen Frears, but I wouldn't swear to that. But again, like her as this, I think she's a reporter in it on the story of this thing that Dustin Hoffman did. And she's just, again, like by far the most interesting part of the movie, because it's such a, and I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, but the movie is very bland and low key. Like it's just not a spectacular, stylish film. It's just kind of simple and slice of life. And the most interesting thing about it is her in it, sort of like at the tail end of her run of just being like an undeniable female lead. But, watching it, it's like the best thing about this is not this sort of high concept plotting or Dustin Hoffman doing like a very mannered, very like 70s methody performance. It's her in this sort of low key 80s, 90s, just like total charm and presence sort of way.
Yeah. That reminds me, I really like her in the film Quick Change, the Bill Murray film, where she's the partner in crime and partner of Bill Murray, and they rob banks and they're just being silly in New York. And I think her energy kind of matches with Bill Murray's in that film, because he's kind of like that. He's kind of easygoing, aloof. In that film, he pushes it a bit to be funnier, but she's like kind of grounding it, but keeping it funny. Like she just keeps the jokes flying, even when they're too heavy because of Bill Murray. And I rewatched that film recently, and there are aspects of it that haven't really aged that well. But her performance is amazing and really like anchors her in the film. Like she's really not just the female lead. She's like a key character. And it's amazing to see her really hold her own with Bill Murray, who is much more known as a comedic actor.
I mean, that to me is like the, key to a great movie star. But obviously in this era, a great female movie star is like, can justifiably have perfect, valid, like movie propelling chemistry with Jeff Goldblum in a horror movie, Jim Carrey and Jeff Goldblum and Damon Wayans in an alien comedy, Alec Baldwin as like movie star comedy in Beetlejuice, other women in Thelma and Louise or League of Their Own, or Dustin Hoffman or Bill Murray. Like it's more just like the sort of excitement of her career is all of these movies are sort of like leads or co-leads with other really huge talent, and all great stars would avail themselves completely triumphantly with that. And she's, to me, like a perfect scene partner for an insane variety of performers. Like, not many people would be great opposite Dustin Hoffman, still trying his hardest to be as intense and serious as he can, 30 years into his career, or Bill Murray. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's just, those are not the same type of actor.
Yeah.
Or like Madonna and Rosie O'Donnell. Like, it's just, for some reason you can drop her into any cast and somehow it works. And that was sort of, obviously the Goldblum collaborations are very exciting and specific, but yeah, that's just like the magic quality.
I totally agree. And it's interesting also how it's kind of like, at the same time, she made the roles she had like more interesting by being her own self and being this kind of grounded but funny, lighthearted, woman actress. But also, I think the parts she got seemed just interesting in themselves as well. Like, A League of Their Own is extremely, for its time. It's 1992, but even, if you compare to today's standards of female roles, it's quite something. And they actually, I think they made a remake like last year maybe. And I think she kind of exemplifies this era when female roles were not that many interesting ones, but she seemed to get a lot of the good ones. And it's interesting that, like, in 2019, she was in Glow season 3 as a former showgirl who's now the entertainment director of this casino hotel. And it's basically kind of a follow-up of her role in A League of Their Own, where now she's graduated from being like an empowered baseball player woman to being like the boss. And I think like they couldn't have cast anyone else in that role in Glow because she really exemplifies that. But I kind of feel like there's been a gap, though, between that era when she was making A League of Their Own and now. And I find it kind of sad that there's not been that much space in comedies, especially maybe for women, and also just female actors that haven't really explored those things. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's pretty. It's very easy you could run down her entire filmography, and maybe should, because it's so weirdly short and concise with huge gaps. But like, her being on Glow is a perfect example of, sort of like she's one of these people that, every time she's been in something for a decade, it's like a comeback, and it's exciting to see her again because she just was sort of absent for a while, but after being so prominent. But using my example of other huge female stars of that era, like, weirdly, the only other one I could even picture successfully being like a prominent supporting role in a totally charming period sitcom that is obviously casting to sort of comment on the fact that this person was extremely famous at the time this movie takes place, would be like, I don't know who else. Like, maybe like Sharon Stone would be the only other one who could like show up on a TV show like that, and it would both be correct and exciting, because I feel like, like, for whatever reason, most of the other peers of hers, I would imagine from this time, like I'm listing like Michelle Pfeiffer or Susan Sarandon or Sigourney Weaver, are like still kind of doing the same sort of thing. Like, they're still very active and they'll pop up in things and be, a fun supporting role in a larger movie. But seeing them in something like Glow would sort of distract. I would be like, yeah, sure. Like, Susan Sarandon's doing a run on this TV show. Like, she seems to work all the time. Who knows? Like, whatever. Whereas seeing Geena Davis do it was like, well, this is really smart because it's a half-hour comedy, but it's like a comedy, about things that are not funny, and it has, commentary on stereotypes and eating disorders and things like that. And like, so it's sort of the same thing she was always doing.
Yeah.
Like, it does seem like, and this I'm sure was pointed out at the time, but like the tone of that show, and I feel like Betty Gilpin as an actress is sort of more in the mode of what Geena Davis was doing at the time, which is that like she's just absolutely so distinct looking and has the training and sort of is a theater actor at heart and a dramatic actor and can do comedy with ease.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of exciting to see her on that show because it's so the tone of some of her early movie. I mean, it's so much like A League of Their Own that bringing in someone from that movie into the show was so appropriate. But yeah, I mean, but it is just like every time she turns up in anything for a decade or more, it's always kind of exciting because she's always good. She still totally is charismatic and like just an easy, natural performer. She looks great and like has lost none of the instincts, but just doesn't, I mean, obviously her career has shifted to activism and things like that are probably more rewarding than being in small parts in big movies. But it is like it's a pretty, to me, like just a very, very bizarrely distinct career that lines up perfectly with like the start of me caring about actors in movies and like the end of me only caring about mainstream actors in movies. So therefore, like she was just always a presence throughout my like growing up and then, early cable and videotape years.
Yeah, she pivoted to activism and that's great. Like she started the Geena Davis Institute on Gender in Media. And basically it's all about promoting greater representation of, not just straight white men. But also I think there's kind of been something that's changed probably in Hollywood, in the industry with female characters. But at the same time, I mean, you're not exactly an example of like Hollywood studios because you're an independent filmmaker. But for instance, when I look at your filmography, you've really written so many female lead characters that always attract the greatest actresses of the time. And yeah, I was wondering like what drove you to that? Is it because of maybe seeing Geena Davis when you were younger, like an influence of seeing great actresses doing great things in the 80s, 90s, or because I think you should make a film for Geena Davis. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that, and my cinematographer, Sean Williams, worked with her on Marjorie Prime.
Right.
Which he shot, which I still haven't seen, but he said she was, great and totally kind and professional and charming and like absolutely showed up to work like with the great attitude on a very, very small movie. And I was very excited to hear that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, she seems game. She seems game to, do whatever seems appealing. And then as now seems drawn towards working in ensembles or working with other actors that she wants to work with. But it would be very extreme to say that my entire origin is seeing her as an actress, as opposed to just someone that I've always really liked. But I mean, it just seems like, again, I've listed these women several times now, but it does just seem like growing up, there were so many more things that I just saw as totally normal, serious mainstream movies, or, as I got to be a teenager, like mainstream independent movies that were all just female driven by this sort of new, again, post 70s generation of women who came up in a very different system than the like Meryl Streep, Diane Keaton, Shelley Duvall generation of like 70s women. And it just was, to me, like so clearly the normal way for there to be talent and performances. And just, as a writer, continues to be incredibly valid. And again, like, it's just hard to say like what mainstream or successful Hollywood actresses would be able to aspire to were it not for bodies of work, like hers that span like into our lifetimes, because you can only, if you could only be inspired by grand, stars of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you wouldn't really feel like that was still a contemporary option. But seeing these kinds of roles, and then, with A Long Kiss Goodnight, which I cited to you, like, sort of becoming like in the action, sort of like one of the first, I mean, again, I'm sure there's 100 other examples that would occur to me, but like, to me, that was one of the first times I had seen a woman at the center of an action movie. like as the main character.
Right.
Which like to me as a teenager was really cool because it was already someone who I liked.
Yeah.
But, you know, the 90s, certainly the 80s, but, you know, the 90s even was not an era that you would have seen a lot of like just run of the mill B level, but big budget Hollywood action movies where the main character is a woman. So like she just sort of ran with that until that was her thing. And then that was sort of like the last movie she made for, you know, 15 years, basically. I guess Stuart Little seems like it's after that, but I can't say I've seen it. But, you know, like that was like that movie for what, I mean, which I guess is obviously a bomb, I'm sure in some way, like it just, that was sort of the end of being totally viable, which is weird because it's a great movie. People really like it now. And it does seem totally ahead of its time in many ways.
It made me think of like, you know, Atomic Blonde, which came out a couple of years ago. Like that's pretty much the same thing. She literally has blonde hair as well when she becomes the spy or whatever.
Yeah.
But that seems, extremely ahead of its time. And from what I understand as well, the character that she plays, Samantha Cain, is not just an action woman, because the story is that she was like a sort of sleeping agent, I think. Like she lost all memory of her previous life as a sort of hit woman. So there's kind of like, there seems to be some kind of background to the action as well, which is really cool, which I think is, if you want to make action movies with women, then like give them a bit more than just like fighting guys and doing stuff. And that seems to be what that film is doing, but I hope I can watch it at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you would enjoy it. It played, again, maybe shortly around the same time as I saw these other movies of hers in the Goldblum Marathon, because it's Shane Black wrote it, so it's kind of Christmassy, as all of his movies are.
All right.
And it played at Alamo around Christmas, maybe 2 years ago. And I hadn't seen it since, you know, the cable days. And it just holds up great. And she's really good in it. And the sort of dual life amnesiac storyline, like she plays it comedically with like a total goofy, aw shucks, like wholesome woman charm, and then becomes, you know, like a modern Charlize type action hero in the second half of the movie. And to me, it just works perfectly, but shows like, you know, I mean, it's basically like the end of a decade of her being, you know, one of the most prominent American female movie stars, and sort of was kind of the one thing that she hadn't really done, like carrying her own action movie after doing dramas, comedies, horror movies, basically everything else, winning an Oscar. And then, so it kind of seems like what I appreciate and respect about her body of work is that, you know, in just over a decade, it kind of touches on every kind of movie that was made in the 80s and 90s, and every kind of hit or miss or cult hit, you know, cult hit for men, cult hit for women, a mainstream hit, awards, acclaim. Like she somehow touched on everything, despite making very few movies, and kind of never really seemed to repeat many of the same beats. I mean, I haven't seen every one of her films, but I've seen almost all of them because, again, there are not many.
In that sense, she's inspiring, and at the same time, we can wonder about why, you know, she kind of stopped making more films, which, you know, there might be many reasons, but yeah, and that's interesting because, you know, we always hear about how the cinema industry, you know, whether it's Hollywood or just, you know, American cinema or mainstream cinema, they always say, well, nobody wants to watch women doing things or whatever. But her entire career demonstrates that is not true. And I just don't understand why that's still a thing. And, you know, Glow has been canceled. I'm not saying that's because it's about women, but it is kind of sad that the one show that has an entire female cast has to be canceled. But it seems like even though she was doing all this amazing work in the 80s and 90s, like not much has changed since.
It almost seems like her institute, not that I'm sure she cares this much, but it almost seems like it is her desire to mathematically analyze what happened to the kinds of movies that she became world famous for making. But I don't know. I mean, that's just a strange career. That's like a perfect run from The Fly through The Long Kiss Goodnight, 86 to 96, then being the mom in a family mouse movie. Yeah. And then that's it. I don't know. I mean, it just feels like maybe there was nothing left. There was no challenges. Certainly by 99, there was no more movies like The Fly, League of Their Own, or Thelma and Louise being made by 2000, which I'm sure has a lot to do with it. But that's also not like an era where it's like, oh, well, now all the great stuff is in TV, because it's kind of before that.
True. And she actually did some TV, I think, in the, like a few years ago. She had a few TV shows of her own that were kind of canceled after one season but had really good reviews. So I wouldn't be surprised if she kind of shows up in some stuff. She was in like Grey's Anatomy for an entire season or something. She did quite a few.
See, that's strange. I mean, I don't know anything about that. The other thing, I mean, we haven't mentioned is like around this time, you know, like my Entertainment Weekly reading awareness, like it was ubiquitous that two other things that we haven't talked about. One is that she was in Mensa.
What's
Mensa?
Mensa?
So like in addition to Mensa International is the largest and oldest high IQ society in the world. Mensa formally comprises national groups known as the Mensa International Organization. So maybe it doesn't stand for anything, but Mensa requirements for membership is a score at or above the 98th percentile on standardized IQ intelligence tests.
Wow.
Minimum acceptable score is 132.
What?
Whereas the median score of an IQ test is 100. So it became very prominent that she was in Mensa, which I don't really know what your responsibilities are once you are in Mensa, except that you are certified a high IQ genius level individual.
Wow.
And I suppose you participate in think tanks and symposiums and whatnot, and that she was like ranked as an Olympic archer.
Yes, I saw about that.
I feel like these are just the two sort of like, did you know factoids.
Trivia. Yeah, I saw about the archer thing. Like she almost went to the Sydney Olympics, but she didn't because she wasn't selected. But she had picked up archery 2 years prior. So just in 2 years, she went from not knowing anything about archery to being a runner-up for the Olympics. So
yeah, I feel like there's, you know, there are always pictures of her like with a hat on, like holding her bow.
Yeah.
Doesn't even really say on Wikipedia what Mensa does, except that they have events for members, regional gatherings. I don't know. I guess they're just like symposiums and think tanks. You know, it's just like a society for eggheads. And it became very prominent that in addition to being uncommonly beautiful and talented and successful, she was a participating member in this, which, you know, has now sort of parlayed into founding her own charitable and academic organizations for screen studies. But we can't not mention these two facts, one of which was apparently news to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But it kind of brings everything together, I think, that she's extremely intelligent. She didn't want to do stupid roles. She wanted to do the good stuff. And then she was like, let me study why cinema isn't what it used to be. Right. I think that's very admirable. And I hope the research she does actually makes some changes. We'll see. I personally really like, again, just from when I grew up, performers that it's so not intense craft. It just seems like coasting with talent, but just sort of coasting on your natural presence and charisma and just the vibe you bring as a personality and a face, which is, you know, so classic in its comprehension of like, that's a star. And I feel like a lot of my favorite 80s and 90s actors and actresses are that. And she, to me, represents that sort of just absolute star quality in a way that like somebody, you know, like, because like she's around at the same time as, but like not at all the same as like Brat Pack women. Like she's so like, for some reason, her and Demi Moore are like 100% opposites in my mind, even though like they're very famous at exactly the same time. And, you know, probably were thought of as the same type of person. Like I'm saying, all these comedies that we're talking about her really being great in, like Demi Moore could not be in Beetlejuice or Earth Girls Are Easy, or like The Long Kiss Goodnight. Whereas I do feel like, you know, overwhelming physical presence aside, like
Geena Davis could be in like a St. Elmo's Fire. Obviously, I guess she's probably a little bit older than that. But, you know, like it just seems like she could fit into these sort of more natural, small scale dramas. But also for some reason, throughout her whole career is doing basically cartoon outsized performances just mixed in as well. There's no like her serious, her goofy phase and then her acclaim Oscar phase. Like it just kind of seems like the phase was just movie star.
Now we're going to move into a new section of the podcast where patrons can leave questions for our guests. So patrons get to find out in advance who the guest will be, and obviously they don't tell anyone, but they can ask questions. So today we have a couple questions for you, Alex. And this first one is an audio recording, and it is from Curtis. Let's hear it.
My question is how your process differs when you work with an actor that you have already worked with before. The case of Elizabeth Moss being in 3 of your films might be the most obvious example. Is it different the second or third time around directing an actor once you've already been through a process of creating previous characters with them?
I think it's a cool question.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and I've done this a couple of times, with a few actors, but I guess if we can just use the 3 Lizzie movies I've made as like a perfect 3-step process where, like, for Listen Up Philip, like as with most things, you write a character, or I write a character, and then you say, I wonder who could play this. I wonder how we want to play this. And, in a movie like that, it could have been any number of types of actresses to play that part. I just locked in on the idea of her because I was such a fan and got very lucky. And then wrote Queen of Earth without telling her, thinking, I'm kind of, now that you know how an actor works, I can tee up a script full of the little things that I have now seen they will run with. Mm-hmm. And I can say, so you know how like, now I know you work like this. Here's like a script that's sort of meant to be elastic based on your process. Would you like to do it? Because I wrote it thinking you would. And then I, again, very lucky. But then on that movie, we were making it a year later. So the Listen Up Philip experience was really fresh. And then Catherine Waterston is in it, who I never worked with and had only met the week before the shoot.
Wow.
And like you're then saying to one lead of the movie, we don't really need to talk because this was all just written with you as a hopeful factor. And then getting to really learn how another lead of the movie works means that like, I'm just kind of juggling less.
Right.
And then by Her Smell, which was me saying, I'm going to write this movie for you. Here's what it's about. Here's the character. So it's, again, like even more extreme. Then like, because that is so much work for an actor, like there's just no, like the process of making that movie at this point, if you're lucky enough to have that sort of repeat thing, like we're not even talking about it. Like the process of showing up to work is me dealing with everything else, but directing the lead actor, because it's coming at the end of 2 or 3 years of talking about the movie and the character. That the day of shooting it, like the last thing that needs to happen is for her and I to talk about the scene. Because we did that the first, second, third, and fourth time she read the script. So like now we're not even really doing anything, not even really talking. So then I'm able to really focus on learning new language with new actors and then saying to them like, so this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. I don't know if this is really a specifically good answer, but to me, like it is just one of my favorite things to just have the comfort of knowing basically what the actor's process will be, because everybody's different, and not having to wonder about that for someone who, in the case of Queen of Earth and Her Smell, is carrying the entire movie on their own performance. not having to really be concerned about that in those two movies gives me a huge peace of mind in the month leading up to it, and certainly during every day of doing it, because I'm never thinking, I think this performance is working, I think this will cut together. It's more just like, I'm not even thinking about it because it's already done. I'm already watching it in a movie theater when we're doing it on set,
right.
because the performance is already over, because the performance started 2 years ago. And yeah, it's just, it's to me, like, the greatest luxury as a writer is to say, I know these words, I know how they're going to be read. I don't know what the performance will be, but I know what it's going to be like to watch this actor sort of just come up with something. I never could have had the confidence to write Her Smell if all I was thinking was, who is going to play this and can they do it? Like, I could only even write the movie because I was like, oh, she'll be great in this scene. This scene feels like this is going to be a lot of fun. This feels like a given. This feels like a total, a fastball coming right at her, instead of writing it and going, am I writing a character that nobody can play? Like, am I writing a thing that is just unactable? It's a real load off to just feel like the performance is already what you want it to be, just because you trust the person to do that.
And now we have the second question, which this time is from a previous guest of ours, which is Jordan Beswick, who's an acting coach. He was on the episode talking about Montgomery Clift, and he's got a very interesting question, I think. So I'm going to read it out to you.
Okay.
So he says, I was very happy to read that you are a word-for-word writer-director. I adore actors who memorize their lines word for word and make it sound entirely unscripted. Actors like Elizabeth Moss, who shared that and then he quotes Elizabeth Moss saying, you shoot 10 to 12 pages a day, so it was like memorizing and performing a mini play every day. You had to know the play that you were doing that day, end quote. How do you feel about actors who don't prepare themselves to that extent for the set, and are you as disciplined when you act? Because you've acted too.
Yeah, not really. I mean, not really, but thank you for charitably saying such. I mean, I feel like the only 3 things I can remember acting in, unless I'm forgetting something, is my own movie, The Color Wheel, where I could only do the dialogue because I wrote it for 2 years. Right. My friend, a movie called La Ultima Pellicula, which had no script and was improvised as a sort of pseudo-documentary in the Yucatan Peninsula. And then my friend Jeff Baina's movie, Joshi, which was improvised. So, like, I have no sense of this process. I just show up and do what people tell me to do. But if someone said, I have a 200-page script I need you to memorize, I would say, I can't do that. You should have someone else do it. Unless I wrote it, in which case I would say, I guess I already memorized it. But, I mean, like, it just depends, like, because, like, she's right. Like, Her Smell was my attempt at being very, very by the book, very word for word, as was Golden Exits, which was the first movie that I made after I sort of became very fascinated with just wanting to lock in on a theatricality of acting and a sort of stage quality, but for the camera. But Queen of Earth and Listen Up Philip were not that at all. Right. And as I was just saying, like, I wrote the Queen of Earth script saying, like, oh, I know that as an actor, she can just riff a little bit within character, not like scenes and dialogue and back and forth, but can sort of create extra little moments, some of which are verbal. And I want to create a script that has room for those. So, like, I did both sort of in these 4 movies that I made in a row. But getting to the point of Golden Exits and Her Smell, which were, me saying, like, I don't want to, like, make these scenes longer than they are. They start and end where they do for a reason. The challenge, and again, like, I'm not coming up with this. I've heard both Noah Baumbach and Greta Gerwig say this about their own movies, but, like, I like the way they say it, so I'm stealing it. Like, the challenge for the actor is you need to create spontaneous, unpredictable moments within what is written, not on top of what is written. And when I heard first him and then later her say that about their scripts, I was like, yes, that's a perfect way to describe it. Because on a movie where you're saying, So the text is locked. We can't really change it. You are not free to explore that impulse, but you are free to explore every single other impulse. I don't care where you walk, but just show us where you're going to do it. I have no, other than what's written, if there's any props you want, or if you want to sit or stand or walk or, you know, lay on the ground, let's figure that out in advance, because I'm open to all of that. But just don't change the way that it's written. But if the way that it's written to you suggests I need to, you know, lay down, then let's talk about that. And if the way it's written suggests to you I need to be, you know, fiddling with my hands and shuffling a deck of cards, let's talk about that too, because that's in play. And I just like throwing that challenge to performers and seeing what they come up with, because it makes, again, this is, I'm just surmising this from watching people work. It means that they show up with all the certain stuff completely under glass, lines ready to go. And then in the case of Lizzie anyway, something that we realized on our third movie was like, that was sort of driving the collaboration, was that I don't prepare myself at all for anything. Like, I don't have shot lists or storyboards. And Sean, my DP, is the same as a cinematographer. He doesn't really want to know anything in advance of watching a rehearsal or a blocking. Right. And we just sort of need to start doing it to know what we want. And Lizzie, as an actress, we realize is the same. She'll come with all of the dialogue completely, not even have to think about it. She can do it 20 times in a row. But then everything else, much like what I'm doing and saying, oh, maybe let's try over here, and Sean going, I think I want to do this, is also her saying, like, I'm going to do it like this, but then I also want to try it this way, so let's maybe do both. So to me, it's just like comfortably finding this weird balance of complete over preparedness and then absolute no plan whatsoever of what you're going to do with it is like the best sort of, you know, it feels just like loose theater, where it's like you're not, the text is over, that part of the process is done. Now the impulses are going to be what we're following, and it, to me as a director and a writer, that is very alive and exciting, and it's just dependent on the actors being able to do that.
I can totally see that in your films, and I think it's a great way to do things.
So like, as a quote unquote actor, I obviously can't do any of that, which is why I refuse that classification for myself.
Fair enough.
Perhaps a good closing thought. So I saw like something where John Mulaney was talking about seeing Jake Gyllenhaal do Sunday in the Park with George on Broadway, and someone was asking Mulaney about acting, and he was like, I can't act. Like, I can like do stuff, read lines or whatever, but I saw Jake Gyllenhaal do Sunday in the Park with George, and I thought, oh, he really thinks he's the character. And I don't know, again, like another perfect distillation that I'm stealing from somebody much more clever than myself. But yeah, that's it. Like watching an actor and going like, oh, wow, they actually believe right now that they are this person. Is like, I mean, that's the real deal.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of You Gotta Act. If you wish to know in advance who our next guest will be and ask them a question, become a friend of You Gotta Act on Patreon. See you next time.